Welcome back, everybody. Today's a very exciting day here on Speedy Garage because we are building a new bike. This is gonna be part one of a three-part mini-series in which we'll be building this bike over here. Now, I'll reveal the bike and what it is in just a moment, but I wanna go into what we're gonna be doing here on this mini-series. Part one, we'll be going over what the bike is and sort of my idea behind it, why I chose this specific bike frame, what my goals are for the bike, essentially what I'm building it for. Part two, we'll go over all of the parts that are going on there, along with their weights. Now, this will not be a weight weenie build. I'll get into that a little bit later, but I will still give you guys weights because I know that's important to some people, including myself. And then part three, we'll do the whole build and we'll take the bike out for its inaugural ride and see how it does. Without further ado, let's get into this bike build. All right, and here we are. This is the bike. It is a 2019 Santa Cruz Tallboy 3 with the CC frame. Now, I know this is an old bike, right? 2019, so now 4 years old, but there are a couple, I think, good reasons why I chose this bike. And let me get into a little bit of the idea behind this build, specifically why I chose to build this specific frame and the kind of rides I'm building it for. So the question is, why would I choose this specific frame to build up when there are so many options out there? Well, I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that I feel that there is a sort of gap in my mountain bike quiver. On one end of the spectrum, I have my Santa Cruz Highball C, which I've been building for the past couple of years. As you guys have seen the build series, we've got it down to about 20 pounds now, very close to that 20-pound range. It is an absolute climb ripper. It's light, it's stiff, it's fast, but it's definitely not a trail shredder, right? If I take it on any sort of technical trails, you very quickly start to see the limits of that bike, even with my very limited skills. On the other end of the spectrum, we have my Ibis Ripmo AF. This thing is a trail shredder with 160 millimeters of front travel, 147 millimeters on the rear, super grippy tires, 2.5 in the front, 2.4 in the back. This thing absolutely eats up any trail I can throw it at, and it is 100% more capable than I am as a rider. However, it is definitely not the kind of bike you want to be doing 20, 30, 40 miles on the trails with, especially something that has a lot of long climbs, because at 35-ish pounds and change with tires that are meant to grip rather than roll, this is not a bike I would want to use for a very long ride. Ultimately, the kind of ride I'm sort of building this bike for is something like my hardco ride, which I did earlier this year. I did the 100-kilometer version, which was, well, obviously 100 kilometers of really sort of steep, long climbs with some technical and bumpy descents mixed in. The Highball, which is what I used for it, was great for the long climbs, but a little bit overmatched on some of the descents, and also just not that comfortable for a 11-ish hour ride. And since next year I'm going to be trying to do the 100-mile version of that ride, I'm essentially building this bike to be something I can use for that ride, although it should also be capable for other rides as well. Essentially something that I can take to the technical trails and have fun, something I can take to the cross-country trails and have fun, something I can sort of do it all. In the beginning, when this bike was first conceived, the Tallboy 3, this was very much a downcountry bike, as the industry calls it. A little bit more capable than a full cross-country bike, but not a full trail bike, so it still has that sort of climbing ability, lightweight nature, and speed. Now, as the years have gone on, the industry has switched to a more aggressive geometry on most of its quote-unquote downcountry bikes. In fact, the new Tallboy, the Tallboy 4, is really rather different than this Tallboy 3, much more towards the trail side of things than the outgoing Tallboy 3 model. In fact, the Tallboy 3 is actually very similar to Santa Cruz's current cross-country bike, the Blur, which is ultimately why I chose this, because I wanted something somewhere between the Blur and the new Tallboy 4. Let me talk a little bit about geometry numbers. I know this might seem a little bit boring, but I think geometry will help us paint a better picture as to why I specifically chose this bike over some of the other alternatives. All right, so I think the big elephant in the room, if I was looking for something a little bit more capable than the Blur, is why didn't I just get a Blur TR or the Blur Trail model, which is Santa Cruz's sort of like downcountry plus model, right? More on the down than the country, if you will. The reason why I chose this over the Blur comes down to two things. One is, most importantly, price. For the Blur TR, if I go with the base level R build, which has the C carbon frame, so the little bit heavier and less stiff frame, that's about $4,500 with a pretty build, I have to say, right? SRAM NX, which is, it's not great. You know, honestly, I've used SRAM X before. I installed it on my friend's bike, and I really wasn't that impressed with it. I think SRAM GX is a really great value, but SRAM NX and definitely SX, I could leave those. If you step up to the $5,500 version, where you get SRAM GX, you're still getting the C carbon, not the CC, and that bike still weighs in at about 26 pounds without pedals or bottle cages. Now, I'm not sure if I can actually get this much below 26 pounds. However, I know for a fact that I'll be able to do it for much cheaper than $5,500 before taxes. So I think from a price point scenario, I think this is a great option. Now, the second reason why I didn't choose the Blur over this is I think the Blur, while it is definitely more on the down version, it is still something that comes with 120 millimeters of front travel, which is better than 100, right? Which is what I have on my highball, but 120 is still, I think, in that sort of cross-country range, where I think kind of 130 is when you start to really get into the kind of down-country-ish range. And in fact, the new Tallboy 4, right, comes with 130 millimeters of travel rather than the 120. So I wanted it to be a little bit more capable than the Blur TR. Is this gonna be a perfect replacement for the Blur TR? No. I do think the Blur TR has slightly better geometry. Obviously, it's a newer bike. They've had time to refine things, but I think this gets pretty close, as you'll see in the geometry numbers in just a second here. And it should still be much faster and more efficient and more of a cross-country bike than the Ripmo. So let's talk geometry numbers for one quick second, and then we'll go into kind of the plan for the build. On the other end of the spectrum, right? So if on one hand we had get the Blur TR, the other end of that spectrum is, well, why don't I just get the Tallboy 4, right? It's the newest model, it's got the most updated geometry, and yeah, it has actually much more aggressive geometry, so that would definitely sort of capture the kind of more trail-oriented nature I'm trying to get here. However, again, a couple of things here. Number one is price. $4,800 for the base build. That's pretty expensive before taxes. And that base build at $4,800 is about 31 pounds, which, I mean, my Ripmo's 34, 35. 31's pretty heavy for a downcountry bike, I have to say, right? I know weight isn't everything, but if I want to pedal this thing for 11 hours plus on the hard co-race next year, I think 31 pounds is a little beefy compared to what would be my ideal sort of marathon bike, which is ultimately what I'm doing here. For those couple reasons there, I threw out the Tallboy 4 as well. And then ultimately, as I started to do some searches, I looked at some Ibis Ripleys. I really like those, but they were hard to find for a good price. You could only get the AF model, which is, again, heavier. And I just sort of landed on the Highball 3. I found a good price for it. It was on Pink Bike from someone who knew bikes. He threw in this nice Fox Float shock with the Kashima coating with the price. It was a good deal, and I pulled the trigger. So now that we've talked about the alternatives, which I could have considered instead of the Tallboy 3, let's talk about the geometry figures and why I ultimately landed on this Tallboy 3 as a good compromise between those two alternatives of the Blur or the Blur TR and the Tallboy 4. So what I did is I compared the geometry figures of the Blur TR, the Tallboy 3, and the Tallboy 4 to sort of get a picture and sort of see where this would fit in along that spectrum, if you will, of geometry figures. I'm going to highlight three main figures today. Obviously, geometry is one of those things that can be sort of more than the sum of its parts, but I do think geometry figures will give us at least a little bit of an idea of how a bike will stack up or compare to something, especially if you already have a bike that you like how it rides, you can sort of compare it to that. So let's talk first about perhaps the most hyped up geometry figure in the industry today, head tube angle. Tallboy 3 is 68 degrees compared to 67.1 for the Blur TR and 65.7 for the Tallboy 4. So obviously Tallboy 4 is by far the slackest at 65.7, and then the Blur TR at 67.1 is rather progressive for a downcountry bike. So you'd say, well, 68, that's pretty steep, right? I mean, the Highball is 69, head tube angle wise. So is that too close? Well, maybe, but I have a trick up my sleeve, and that is that I'm going to over fork this bike just a little bit. Now, Santa Cruz does say that you can run either a 120 or a 130 fork on this frame, and I'm gonna run a 130. And the rule of thumb is for every 10 millimeters of increased travel, you get about a half degree of slack added to the head tube angle. So since I'm adding 10 millimeters from 120 to 130, that'll bring the head tube angle down from 68 degrees to 67.5, which is pretty close to the Blur TR and more progressive than the regular Blur, which is, I forget exactly, but I believe 67.9 or like 68.1, something along those lines. So we are getting slacker geometry compared to the regular Blur. We're getting very close to the Blur TR, but we're not going so slack like the Tallboy 4, in which we're gonna lose some of that better, climbing ability that a somewhat steeper head tube angle will afford you. All right, next up, we're gonna take a look at wheelbase. Now, wheelbase dictates how stable a bike will be at speed, which is why a lot of sort of like enduro sled type bikes or something like my Ripmo, they tend to have pretty long wheelbases, which essentially makes the bike handle better the faster you go. A shorter wheelbase, however, will make the bike more agile, somewhat obviously, right? If you want to do sort of tight turns or you're kind of going through switchbacks and stuff like that, you're going to want something a little bit shorter. So finding that balance between stability at high speed and agility, that's sort of where you get the trade-off between wheelbase. Okay, so the Tallboy 4 comes in at 1,227 millimeters in terms of wheelbase. It is the longest of the three. The Blur TR comes in at 1183, and the Tallboy 3 comes in at 1165. So the Tallboy 3 is the shortest, though it is a little bit longer than the regular Blur, which I would have liked it to be maybe a little bit closer to the Blur TR, but we're talking about a difference of ultimately less than 20 millimeters, 18 millimeters. I don't think I'm going to really notice that, and I think it will be sort of good enough for the types of trails I plan on bringing it on. I may be wrong, I guess we'll find out once we get the bike built up, but I was relatively happy with this figure of the wheelbase. Again, maybe a little bit longer would have been nice, but I think it's close enough in the ballpark where I will still enjoy this bike on more technical trails without giving away too much in terms of agility for those long switchbacky climbs. And then finally, I looked at chainstay length, which also contributes to overall stability. Again, sort of like wheelbase, the longer means the more stable, and the shorter means the more agile. Now, chainstay length, these bikes are all very comparable. It is 437 millimeters for the Tallboy 4, 435 millimeters for the Blur TR, and 432 millimeters for the Tallboy 3. So again, the Tallboy 3 is the shortest of the three, although again, a little bit longer than the regular Blur. And while I would have liked that figure to be a little bit closer to the Blur TR, again, I don't really know if I'm gonna notice a 3 millimeter difference compared to the Blur TR. I think this is gonna be in the ballpark of the Blur TR, maybe just a smidge more on the cross-country side of things than the down-country side of things, but I think that's okay for what I'm gonna be using this bike for. On the technical trails, it's not gonna be my Ripmo, but I know that. If it's a little bit more cross-country on those long rides, I will appreciate that. So all in all, I think the geometry figures for the Tallboy 3 make sense for what I'm building this bike for. So the ultimate question here is, can I take this Tallboy 3 frame that I bought and turn it into the marathon downcountry bike that I want? Will I be able to keep it light, fast, and budget while also keeping it capable on the more fun technical trails? Or will this be a spectacular failure in which I bought the totally wrong frame? Now, you guys let me know what you think down below in the comments. Was this the right frame for the job? Should I have looked at something else? What would you have bought instead? Or did I do a good job? Is this a frame that you would consider for a sort of marathon downcountry bike? So that was part one of this 3-part series. In the next part, part 2, we'll be going over the specific parts I'll be putting on the bike. I'll be weighing all of the components for the bike and getting sort of a ballpark figure of what I think the bike is going to weigh. And then in part 3 of this series, we'll actually be putting the bike together. We're gonna take it out on some trails and see how it does. Please stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 of this series. I'll make sure to release them in a short amount of time so I don't have to keep you all waiting for too long. Let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you all for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't done so yet, and I'll see you soon.